Hello and welcome to Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University. I am Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of the election law program here at Ohio State. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Ned Foley, the Director of our election law project, Tony Goggin, a Senior Fellow of the election law program and a faculty member at the Drake College of Law, and Terry Enns, a faculty member at OSU and also a senior fellow of the election law program. This is a special edition of the podcast because with today's session, we begin our second season of this podcast. And we're especially delighted that our director, Ned Foley, has returned from a year in which he was on leave. He spent most of the past year as the Crane Fellow in Law and Public Policy at Princeton University. And then over the summer, Ned had the opportunity to spend a month at the University of Melbourne as a visiting scholar there, where he delivered a significant lecture at the end of July. And since his return to Ohio State, we've had a bit of an opportunity to hear a few of Ned's reflections on some differences between election law in Australia and election law in the United States. And what we are excited to be doing today is to be able to talk a little bit more about some of those differences, and to begin by just inviting Ned to tell us a little bit of what he was noticing as some of those comparisons while he was in Australia last month. Well, so Ned, yes, go ahead.
So it's great to be back home with all of you and to have this opportunity to reflect on some wonderful experiences that I've had. I certainly feel very privileged to have had both the year-long sabbatical and to be at Princeton, and then this month in Australia that we're going to focus on. It is good to kind of get away from home for a while to change perspective, and certainly to go to Australia so far away is a real eye-opener in terms of reminding you about things about home and comparisons. And I'd encourage anybody in the United States who hasn't had a chance to visit Australia that if they're able to do that, for lots of reasons, it's interesting. The fact that the United States and Australia both inherit their legal system from Great Britain, but have taken that inheritance in very different directions is a useful comparison. One maybe obvious one, but really came home to me just from talking to people there for a whole month is the fact that in America we chose to have a presidential electoral system. We have an elected president as well as an elected legislature, and they have the parliamentary system that they inherited from Britain. They nominally still have a monarchy, right? Australia still shares the monarchy with Britain, and it feels that the monarchy has less of a presence in Australia than in Britain from the times that I've been in Britain, but there are still, you go to the Royal Park and you hear about the Royal Commission, and you're reminded that there is the reality of that. And in fact, the biggest constitutional crisis that Australia experienced, in fact, they were celebrating they were commemorating or acknowledging the 50th anniversary of the time where the royal governor of Australia dismissed the prime minister, and that was a huge constitutional crisis in Australia, and that was really interesting to hear about. But for the most part, their government is this parliamentary system where the prime minister is chosen by the legislature, and there are vast differences between presidential systems and parliamentary systems. So that's something worth talking about if you guys are interested. There's lots of differences in details between Australia's election law and American election law. One that was of obvious interest to me was the fact that they use a version of what we in the United States call ranked choice voting. They call it preferential voting. The research that I have been doing, as some people may know, is on various kinds of ranked choice voting. And in fact, lecture that Steve alluded to was on a particular version of ranked choice voting that comes out of Australian scholarship. So we could talk about that too. But what surprised me in terms of the biggest difference and the aspect of their system that they raised all the time was their compulsory voting. Australians have an obligation to vote. It's not just a right, it's an obligation. They get fined $20 if they don't. Now, they don't have to, they're very careful about explaining what the obligation is. The obligation is to show up at the polls and sign into the poll book. But they can decide, in essence, to vote for none of the above. Right? They can abstain, but they have to go through the trouble of formally showing up to abstain. So you can call it compulsory voting, but it's compulsory participation, and they think it's the most important feature of their electoral system. Having done a lot of innovation, we in the United States use something that we call the Australian ballot, which is the secret ballot, and we think that's a pretty important feature. So they might have thought that was the most important aspect of their system, but no, they think the compulsory voting is most important. And if you want to, we can explore why they think that and how that might relate to a comparison between their democracy and ours.
Yeah, I do think we ought to hear a little bit more about why they think it's the most important feature.
I think they think two things about it. I think they think it helps to avoid polarization. Their view is that if everybody turns out, you're more likely to get the representation from the center or the middle of the electorate. That if you make participation voluntarily, you're more likely to get people showing up from the extremes. And so voluntary participation, in their view, would hollow out the center. And so there's more social cohesion as a result of compulsory voting, just in terms of causing a difference in turnout. So I think that's their point number one. Point number two is a different kind of social cohesion point, the making voting a civic obligation and not just a civil right or a civic right. They think puts people in the mindset of being civically minded, civically oriented. And so voting becomes an activity that you do on behalf of the community. It's not an activity you do to assert your own rights or your own interests. And I do think that sense of social solidarity that's tied to the compulsory voting feels very genuine in terms of how they talk about it, and did cause me to reflect on whether that's an aspect of our electoral system in the United States that we're lacking. I mean, I'm a big fan of voting rights and, really think it's, a crucial element of American history was the civil rights revolution of the 1960s, or the civil rights movement, and we got the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And, I'm all in favor of rights, but I don't think you have to talk about rights to the exclusion of duties and obligations. Voting can be both a right and an obligation, which is how they think of it in Australia. And I think we in the United States are missing that obligation piece. Can you get that sense of obligation even without, the compulsory voting? I don't know, but I would think our democracy in the United States would be healthier if every American voted thinking that they were performing a public function, and they were performing a public function in their best judgment on behalf of the community as a whole, whereas our notion of interest group politics in the United States means that politics is like everybody is competing, to win, and to get an advantage out of the electoral process. And it's much more self-interested or group interested, but not the whole community interested. It could be parties fighting each other, or it could be labor versus business, or unions versus business. And of course, there are parties in Australia, and there's different points of view, but there's still this orientation that you, as a citizen, you do this on behalf of the community, whereas I think most Americans feel like they vote on behalf of themselves, their family, their narrower community, not their broader community.
Ned, could you discuss the mechanics of compulsory voting in Australia, particularly with regard to voting by mail? Voting by mail is obviously, for much of the United States, a new development. I guess this depends really on how long compulsory voting has been a feature of Australian election law, but does Australia have a long history of voting by mail to account for people with mobility issues or other obstacles that make it difficult for them to appear in person to vote?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'll be candid. I'm less familiar with all the details of Australian election administration, compared to our own election administration. But my understanding is, yes, they do have vote by mail, and you can fulfill your compulsory voting obligation to, again, you have to kind of go through the process and functionally cast a ballot, as it were, in terms of showing your participation. But you can leave the ballot blank in terms of, with a particular race, you can, as long as you return the mailed ballot, that satisfies compulsory voting. You don't actually have to hold your nose and pick a particular candidate that you don't like.
Ned, given the compulsory nature of it, how many people do completely opt out and just take the fine? Like what percentage is the voting percentage in Australia?
Yeah, it's very high. It's well above 90%, avoid the fine by doing what is required of them. I can't remember whether it's as high as 97% or 98%, but it's way up there. And certainly, compared to, American turnout percentages, where we're often below 50% in some states, even in presidential elections, right? And sometimes we're much lower than that in a midterm or an off-year election. They dwarf our turnout numbers.
And I suppose it's those turnout numbers that matter, regardless of whether the fine is enforced in some effective way or not. But I guess there's another dimension of it, which is whether there are people who are assessed the fine who don't bother to pay the fine either, and multiple levels of thinking about what the logistics of enforcement are. But again, the key point is that you've got turnouts in the mid 90% range or so.
Yeah, and again, I did not do polling, and so the extent to which I talked to Australian citizens about this was not a scientific, survey, public opinion survey, and I did get out of Melbourne to visit some other areas, but I was primarily there. And of course, the people that I hung out with were mostly associated with the university, so educated group of people. But I will say, I talked to people who thought of themselves as politically conservative. I talked to people who thought of themselves as politically liberal or progressive, people who thought of themselves as moderate. So in that sense, I did talk to a wide spectrum of Australian views, people who would vote for different political parties, for example. And every single Australian that I spoke to, regardless of their ideology, was extremely proud of compulsory voting and thought it was a really important and defining feature of their system. So it wasn't like there was this was only something that some people liked and other people didn't like. And again, that surprised me. I would have thought there would have been more divergence of opinion on something that's compulsory, but no. I mean, they really, it was wrapped up in their sense of national identity, and again, much more so than the so-called Australian ballot, and so I think for many of them, the idea of paying the fine, that just wouldn't be how they would think about that. They would be sort of against their whole nature of their being to think that they wouldn't actually participate. And again, even though I talked to some people who opted out in just the way of not voting for particular candidates, but they still thought it was important that they signify their disappointment with their choices, but express that through casting the protest vote, if you will. So I was struck by the uniformity of enthusiasm. Not just it wasn't begrudging. There was an enthusiastic embrace of this cultural tradition and practice.
Ned, how do you think that geography influences Australian election law? Like the United States, Australia is a continental nation, but unlike the United States, it's also a country with a small population. I just looked up the World Factbook, and the United States now has about 340 million people, but Australia only has 28 million people. How do you think the election laws of Australia are shaped by the fact that it's 28 million people who inhabit a continental-sized nation, and yet they are part of a federal unified, not republic, I guess, since they're still part of the monarchy, but a federal union. How do you think geography influences their election laws?
Yeah, really very perceptive question. They kept reminding me that they think of themselves as a small country. And they kept reminding me of just that population. They're smaller than California, considerably so, in terms of population. Because, again, my first instinct is to think of them as a big country just because the size of their continent is so large and roughly the size of the United States. So it weighs on them very heavily that they view themselves population-wise as small. I'm not sure that the fact that they're spread out across the continent makes a difference. What does make a difference is they are an unbelievably urbanized nation, despite all that vast territory. There are people who live in the so-called outback or in farming communities, but the percentage of Australians who live outside what we would call a city or a citified suburb, a metropolitan area, and feel of themselves as part of a city existence is a tiny fraction of their population, much smaller than the United States. And so that probably much more than anything else, defines them politically. Their politics would be different if the size of their rural population was a lot larger. And they have something of the rural-urban divide that we have in the United, the big cleavage that I see in American politics right now, as I think we've discussed, is the urban-rural divide in terms of populism and attitudes about government and so on and so forth. And the flip that the two political parties have made, some of it is education-based, but some of it is just rural versus urban. Australia is, worried that they're kind of going down that road of polarization. They're not nearly as far along as the United States is, but to the extent that they see, warning signs, it's because rural Australia sees the world differently than urban Australia does in terms of things like immigration and cultural identity and the fear of losing cultural identity and those sorts of things. But because they're so urban, that all plays out in a different way than it does in the United States. They are a federal system, absolutely, But interestingly enough, despite a strong sense of that federal system, I mean, I had not appreciated nearly how much people think of themselves in addition to being citizens of Australia and governed by the government of Australia. Melbourne is in Victoria, and Victoria is different from New South Wales and is different from Queensland and the other different segments of the overall federal system. So that's very real, but they do election administration at the national level. They have a national election commission, so they have much more uniformity in election administration despite the federalism. It's not complete uniformity. There is some federalism variation in terms of election rules, but they don't have anything like the decentralization that we have in the United States in terms of election administration. So, that's sort of how I process your question about, how does federalism apply there compared to here in the United States?
So I find myself wondering about a couple of historical dimensions of this, which you may or may not really have at your fingertips. I was wondering how long Australia has had compulsory voting. And then I'm also wondering whether it's also always had a federally run system of elections or whether that was a relatively more recent move to nationalize the way in which elections were run, and whether there's any relationship between the fact that the elections are run primarily at the national level and the fact that there is compulsory voting. Anyway, all that's a set of questions about how did Australia get to the system that they have today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know some of that. I wish I knew more. By the way, let me just make the observation that Australians know so much about American politics and government, and they really study it closely. Just to give you an example, I was there shortly after the primary election in the New York mayoral race. And they were so interested in that, and not because there's ranked choice voting, that they just wanted to know who was going to be the next mayor of New York City, and therefore who the candidates were and what was the likely outcome. They really follow U.S. politics at a granular level. They were asking me, about what was Susan Collins's chance for re-election in Maine. I mean, I don't, even know anything about who's running for office for Victoria, for example, and so it was a little embarrassing, maybe still is, just how little I felt I knew about Australia compared to everything that they knew about America. It's incredibly asymmetrical. Maybe some of that goes back to the fact that they see themselves as small and us big, that we're the the historical superpower, and they're not. So that's relevant. The other thing I'll say, and then you'll have to remind me of your question because I'm going off on a tangent. But I was struck by how cosmopolitan a city is that Melbourne is, and therefore, and because Melbourne, has a huge percentage of Australia's population along with Sydney. Just how cosmopolitan Australia is. They very much feel themselves part of the Pacific Rim and very tied to all of Asia. And there's just, the percentage of Australian residents that are foreign born is huge, much bigger than the United States. So you might think of Australia as sort of isolated by oceans and just geographically isolated, but that's not the social reality. The social reality is they're very much in and of Asia, and all sorts of Asia. I mean, it's China, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Malaysian, Indonesian, India. I mean, and so I had not anticipated that. I sort of expected it to be roughly an Anglo inheritance culture like the United States is to a large degree, but it feels much, much more multicultural than, and I have experience with New York and other big cities in the United States, and it pales in comparison to just how multicultural I think Australia is. And we can come back to the relationship of Australia to their Aboriginal community, which is another interesting thing. But before we do that, if you want to, Steve, remind me of your most recent question before I went off on a tangent.
Yeah, well, the tangent's great. And it really is instructive to realize how much other countries, the people of other countries know about us compared to what we don't know much detail about them. So I was probing you a little bit on a detail of Australia, particularly a historical one, and wondering what you can say about when and how Australia adopted compulsory voting, and that's now a requirement that is extended nationwide. And you have said that elections are run primarily by the national government, whereas in the U.S. our elections are primarily overseen by states and localities. And we could have compulsory voting in the U.S. in a particular state, I suppose, and not in another state, whereas in Australia, it's all one system. And is there a relationship between having a more national set of election processes and compulsory voting? And when did that all come together for them?
So it's about 100 years that they've had compulsory voting. I can't remember if it was exactly in the 19-teens or 1920s, but roughly 100 years is what I remember learning from my discussions with them. And if I've got this, if I'm remembering it correctly, there was a little partisan contestation that caused it to be put in place in the beginning. But again, once it was adopted, or at least as it's evolved over time, it's embraced by everybody. So it wasn't, we shouldn't be so naive to think that it was just absolute purity that caused, changes in Australian election law. But nonetheless, there's been beneficial effects of the things that have gotten adopted. Australia was each part of Australia was its own colony before there was consolidation or unification. I forget the exact term that they used for it. It was around 1900 where an act of the British Parliament brought all the different states or territories or colonies together into one consolidated Australia. And funnily enough, the Constitution of Australia was promulgated by the British Parliament, which causes some cognitive dissonance in Australia. And from time to time, and they've had some amendments through national referenda. They have a national referendum mechanism as a way to amend the Constitution. And whereas our constitutional amendment process is not a plebiscitary one. It's Congress votes and then the state legislature votes, but they have a plebiscitary amendment process that allows them to really feel like they've, as citizens, embraced the Constitution that they have as amended, because they could have completely amended it, but they've kept large parts of it. But nonetheless, their origin story is a very different origin story of James Madison and the other founders sitting in Philadelphia. It's the British Parliament sitting thousands of miles away, and it was a big deal. It was a big deal when the Australian Supreme Court declared Britain a foreign country for purposes of Australian law, because even after essential independence, they didn't quite see Britain as a foreign country, but now it is considered a foreign country. So there's sort of aspects. I mean, I know we're talking election law and stuff, but there's aspects of Australian constitutional law that are kind of fascinating for American constitutional scholars. And And we would do well, I think, to be much more comparative in our thinking than we are. It's this aspect of not really knowing about other countries and not really caring about other countries. I mean, it happened to be that the University of Melbourne Law School has a center on comparative constitutional studies. So they've institutionalized and are, I think, preeminent, maybe worldwide in the English-speaking world. I mean, there are other institutions, I'm sure, that do it too, but it's a very, high-powered law school with lots of really exciting and good and important thinking, and they devote a lot of time and attention to comparative thought in a way that feels more than what I'm familiar with in sort of American legal academia. I know there are comparativists, there are people that do teach comparative constitutional law. We have case books in it, but it seems to be even more systematic and more. They can't go through their day. If somebody's thinking about constitutional law in Australia, they're inevitably thinking about it in comparative terms in a way that it's not inevitable that Americans think about it in comparative terms. Again, that's another aside, but relevant to your question, Steve, is they were doing election law at the level of New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland and South Australia before they became consolidated. And in fact, their first experiments with preferential voting or ranked choice voting was at the regional level before it was at the national level. I'm not certain whether there was experimentation with compulsory voting, again, at the regional level before it was adopted nationally. I just am not, I'm ignorant of that point at the moment, but they couldn't go back to regional variation at this point, at least, for the federal elections. And again, I don't think they'd want to go back at all. So again, their origin story does allow for richness of the experience of regional government even before national government, but they just made a conscious choice to be much more, their federalism is much more nation, centered than even the American federalism story has become over the last century or so. Does that answer the question?
Yep.
Ned, in terms of election administration, what are the things that you think that they federalized and that's a good thing? And what are a few things that they didn't federalize, just so we know what are still more regionally controlled?
So the one thing that they definitely federalized that is a good thing if we could pull it off is nonpartisan election administration. They have an election commission that handles both redistricting and then issues about how to structure the electoral process. And by the way, if you have compulsory voting, you don't have voting wars over things like voter ID and voter registration, because the American fights over election administration are trying on a partisan basis to game the turnout thing, right? I mean, let's be honest about this. It's like, one party thinks it's in its advantage to increase turnout, so it wants certain rules to do that. The other party, wants to damp down turnout, and it adopts certain rules. Well, if you start from the baseline of everybody's obligated to vote, your policy debates about election and administration aren't about manipulating turnout levels. So that in and of itself, I think, is a really important difference. But beyond that, I mean, when they talk proudly about their nonpartisan election commission, I say that many American skeptics would say, "Come on, there's no such thing as nonpartisanship. Everybody is thoroughly partisan one way or the other. You couldn't create a nonpartisan body in the United States." And not that that's my view. I just know that some people in the United States would say that, and that would be the kind of the devil's advocate point here. And they go, no, 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 no. Yes, people have partisan affiliations, but there is a genuine culture of the civil servants who populate the nonpartisan commission. They believe are genuinely nonpartisan. And again, the people that believe that come from different party backgrounds. The other thing is because they have preferential voting, although they have two dominant parties, well, actually, it's an interesting combination. They have one party of the center left, which is called the Labor Party, is a dominant party on the center left, and it won a big landslide in May, and so that's the governing party at the moment. But the opposition party is actually a coalition of two parties, right? They have a liberal party that's name is the Liberal Party, but it's actually a sort of a conservative party in our terminology. And the kind of conservatism it is more business-oriented, Chamber of Commerce. It's the conservative element of the urban population. So, the kind of financial interests and business interests. And there's another party, which I think now goes by the name of the National Party, but it changed its name, I think, relatively recently. So don't hold me to exact names, but it's entered a coalition with the Liberal Party to be the opposition to the Labor Party. And that coalition has been around, I think, for several decades now. And that coalition broke apart after their defeat in May, but within a week it formed back together. So one of the things that interests me about Australia going forward is that coalition stable, or does it fracture even more? Because the secondary party, the less urban, the rural party within that conservative coalition is a more populist party. I mean, I don't think any part of Australia is exactly analogous to the Trump MAGA faction of the Republican Party, but if there is one, it's this secondary faction of the coalition is more anti-immigration, more populist in the way that we're starting to see right of center populist parties throughout various democracies, right? I mean, we're seeing it in France and Germany and Hungary, and so there is a movement within Australia that is a right-wing or at least right-of-center populist movement that is a different interest and different political identity than traditional business-oriented conservatism, free market conservatism. And so that coalition is potentially fragile. And they have other parties. They have a Green Party, and then they have something called the Teals, which are kind of independent. They call them crossbenchers. That's a term within, Australian parliamentary law. Like these are members of Parliament or the legislature who don't sit either with the majority or the minority party, but are crossbenchers who can be a factor. And so that's how is that relevant, Terry? I mean, so the reason why that's relevant is I think it's easier to claim that there can be something that's genuinely nonpartisan in a multi-party system. When everything is just two-party antagonism, you're either with us or against us, whereas they've been able to diffuse that conflict and make it more fluid than we have in the United States. And I think that's significant.
Ned, as you know, we are in the middle of an unusual period of mid-decade redistricting in a number of states in the United States. In Australia, are the members of their parliament elected in single-member districts? And if so, what are the rules that govern redistricting in Australia? Do they use criteria similar to that used in the states of the United States?
So great question. So their lower house of of their national legislature is single member districts. And so they use ranked choice voting, or what I like to call instant runoff voting, that form of a preferential ballot or ranked ballot, to elect one member from each district to their House of Representatives. And it's that body that produces a prime minister. But legislation to pass, to be law, it has to pass both chambers of the national legislature, and the Senate is not single-member district. The Senate is multi-member district ranked choice voting, which in the technical jargon of election systems is sometimes called the single transferable vote, which is you fill out a ranked ballot, but it's used to elect several people at once from the same, much wider geography than, so it's a form of proportional representation, it turns out to be, unlike single-member districts. And it's a method of elections that a lot of political scientists in the United States wish the U.S. House of Representatives would use. Lee Drutman, for example, is a political scientist. But I think there was a coalition of 100 or 200 political scientists who signed a statement in the last year or so, hoping for a version of that system to be adopted in the United States. And there's a bill that gets it put into the hopper perennially that would make that change for America. And of course, it's never happened and doesn't have much prospects. But what that does is it means that, in theory, gerrymandering might be relevant to the lower house in a way that it wouldn't be relevant to the upper house, or not nearly as much. But they claim, and I didn't do an independent study of it, but they claim they don't have a gerrymandering problem because of their nonpartisan independent commission that they, think, does it fairly, and people just accept that the lines should be fair lines, and you run your elections after the nonpartisan commission determines the lines. So they're not smug about it, but they're very worried about American democracy, and they feel lucky that they don't have some of the pathologies that we seem to have. And they're looking. They talked about gerrymandering. They were totally up on what was going on in Texas. Again, they follow this very closely. So they wanted to know whether California was really going to fight fire with fire, and what was Illinois going to do, and what was Missouri. I mean, again, they study this very, very closely. And that's not just election law professors. That's students who are engineering students, or just ordinary folks.
So I've got both an empirical question and then a lessons for the United States question. The empirical question comes back to the observation you began with concerning compulsory voting, that for Australians, the most important, one of two of the reasons that they see compulsory voting as the most important dimension of their elections was that they thought it was contributing to less polarization among the electorate. And then in the course of our discussion today, you've identified at least four other characteristics that I think might reduce polarization. One is that they're much more urbanized. There isn't the urban-rural divide. Another is that they have nonpartisan election administration. Another is that they have a multi-party system. That means you're not going to have the same degree of polarization. Another is that there is at least some degree of proportional representation instead of this more winner-take-all. The instant runoff voting, all those things arguably contribute or could to reduce polarization, which leads me to wonder, difficult as it would be given those potential confounding factors, whether there's good research, political science studies of any kind about the extent to which compulsory voting might reduce polarization? Do you know whether there are studies like that?
Yeah, I'm unaware of anything specific. I wouldn't be surprised if there is. I mean, they have a robust political science profession in terms of in Australia academics. And again, most of my academic conversations were with law professors as opposed. I mean, I did talk to some political scientists. So, and I think it's a totally appropriate research. I mean, again, I'm not capable of doing the regression analysis, but some sophisticated political scientists could look at those 6 or 7 variables and maybe tease out some kind of causality, maybe, compulsory voting versus these other factors. But so again, I think. I don't know if this is responsive, but they go about their business thinking as if they know the truth about this, even if there isn't the empirical study right at their fingertips, right? They tell a cultural story about themselves that's important,
Sure.
and that cultural story is important to them, I think, in a real and meaningful way, even sort of independent of what the empirical data might be on that point.
So that relates to my question about lessons for the US too. I mean, I can see why compulsory voting might in fact lead to a culture in which you felt there's less polarization. And in fact, because of that feeling, you were acting in ways that contributed to less polarization. And I also really like the social cohesion, the sense that voters are voting not necessarily just for their own self-interest, but thinking about the community when they go to the voting booth. But all that being said, there's reasons why compulsory voting might be attractive, as long as we're not forcing anybody to actually vote for a particular, they can choose to pick none of the above. The prospects of having compulsory voting in the US in any near-term scenario seem remote, to say the least, that we're not going to be getting there. And one of the reasons—
And I told them that again and again and again.
You told them that over and over, yeah. Well, and one of the reasons is that, as you said a few minutes ago, in the US, we have huge fights about turnout, or what kinds of election mechanics are going to produce what kinds of changes in turnout. And compulsory voting, obviously, is the 800-pound gorilla about turnout. And so that alone means it's going to give rise to just this pitched battle if it ever became a serious possibility, which I don't see that it will, but at least in the short term. But Australia did this 100 years ago, thinking more about the long-term possibilities here. Do you see some way in which at some moment we might have compulsory voting in the US?
I don't know. I don't think in our lifetimes, unfortunately. By the way, I should say, back to your earlier question about polarization, that I do know that Australian political scientists are studying polarization in Australia and are documenting that it is on the rise. Again, not that the causality is this or that, or the lack of polarization is caused by such and such, but they are very worried about, as I said earlier, about going down that road. And so they are trying to document the degree to which they are susceptible to this disease, as it were. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to get that point out there. I think we would have to have such a cultural transformation in the United States. Before, we have such a libertarian social DNA, whether it comes from Thoreau or the Wild West or what have you. I mean, we just do not like being told what to do. Americans, I think, that I had thought that Australia had a similar libertarian streak, but they don't compared anything like the United States. Another aspect of this is, they are very proud about their degree of gun control. And even the most conservative people that I talk to, and the most conservative members of, that right-wing coalition or right-of-center coalition, they don't have anything kind like the Second Amendment culture that we have in the United States. And that is, I think, a big factor in terms of their politics compared to our politics. So I know you were asking about compulsory voting and not about gun rights and the relationship of guns to electoral democracy. But I just think we would have to go through, in the United States, a big change in our cultural attitudes before we could kind of create the kind of electoral democracy that they have in Australia. Regrettably, I think, from my perspective, but I just think that's the reality of it. I think we have to work within what's feasible within the United States, and what our feasible reform horizon is going to be, much different than what Australian democracy currently looks like, I think. Again, I want to, if I can, come back, to one point that I made at the outset, and then this other thing that I alluded to. To me, I think the United States is going to struggle with the fact that we have this presidential system that, we're stuck with unless we can reform it. We've done well as a nation, the United States, having an elected president pursuant to our odd electoral college since the beginning, since our Constitution was founded. And yet it seems to me that, the real stress on American democracy, there are other factors that feed into it, but the existence of our presidency as an institution is causing stress. And I think it contributes to we polarize around the office of the presidency and around presidential elections in a way that, again, we have a two-party system, they don't, but the contestation becomes so acute around presidential elections, it's not quite as acute in the Australian context. So that's something that I think we really have to worry about, that Australia, for their benefit, doesn't have to worry about. And then again, if I can come back to the point about the current Australian, what's the right word, how they are coping with and handling their, the legacy of their race discrimination and how they mistreated their Aboriginal population and what they're trying to do with that. That weighs very heavily on their minds, again, across the political spectrum, in a way that feels very different from the politics of race relations in the United States. For one thing, the politics of race relations in the United States is largely dominated by issues that grow out of African American slavery, which is different from the American mistreatment of Native Americans, right? And so, to fully understand Australian electoral democracy, one has to understand that it's dominated by a concern of what is the role of their Aboriginal population. And their Aboriginal population is a small percentage of their population. It's only like 3% currently, which is roughly comparable, I think, to, the percentage of Native American population. So, and yet they spend a lot more time worrying about fairness vis-a-vis that 3% minority. I think it's fair to say in the United States, we spend relatively little time thinking about that issue of fairness. We spend a significant amount of time thinking about fairness to the African American population, which is a much bigger percentage. It's a minority, but it's a much bigger minority. And so, So I think, how they deal with their issues is just different and interesting compared to how we deal with our roughly comparative issues.
Ned, you mentioned the distinction between the American presidential system and the Australian parliamentary system. What is the role of the Prime Minister in Australian life? Does the Prime Minister loom over Australian politics in the same way that the President does, or does the Prime Minister have a more modest role in the Australian system?
Yeah, I think it is more modest. Another perceptive question. Again, for one thing, the Prime Minister as head of government isn't the head of state. And again, even though they're not completely hung up on royalty, they do have a bifurcation of that role, the kind of symbolic head of state role and the trappings of head of state are just don't attach to the Prime Minister in the same way that, we in the United States invest head of state functions. And, in theory, you could say that the Speaker of the House is our head of government, but we don't think of it that way. We think of our president as our head of government as well as head of state. So I think that in and of itself makes the Prime Minister role less dominant. But my wife was struck by how in the media, they call their Prime Minister by a nickname that we, even sort of official media reports in a way that we don't really do in American media discourse, and adding to her, I think, astute observation in that point is I was struck by just how informal Australian culture is. I mean, this phrase of talking about, hey mate, what do you think, mate? I mean, there is a kind of informality to their culture, which I was struck by more so, and I would have thought, again, being a country that has a royalty in some dimension, you'd think they would be more formal, but they feel more informal than this. So they just don't treat their Prime Minister as seriously as we treat our politicians. It's just the informality of their culture, knocks people off the pedestal much more than we do.
Well, I think we maybe better leave it there for now, although we could keep going for quite a while. These are really interesting comparisons, and I think we've just scratched the surface on many of them. But it's great to have you back, Ned, and we really are delighted to hear some of those reflections on what you observed during your month in Australia. And it's a good encouragement to all of us to pay a little more attention to some of those other democratic structures around the world. And maybe we can all look forward to opportunities to do some travel as well. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm delighted to have been with all of you today. And I'll look forward to the next time we're together recording another podcast. Thanks
for giving me the opportunity to share these impressions. And I do think we can use, or I'm going to try to use them to help think about, ways to improve American democracy, even if we can't automatically adopt something like compulsory voting.